The canyon walls threw her music back at her like the whole world was mocking the sound of a fiddle nobody wanted to hear. And that was how Hugh Alden found her, standing alone on a flat red rock in the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1876, playing to an audience of nothing but stone and sky. He had been 3 days coming down out of the Wind River Range with a string of pelts on his mule and a hunger in his belly that made his footsteps heavy, and he heard the fiddle before he saw her. The sound came thin and sweet through the narrow throat of the canyon, bouncing off rock faces that had never once clapped for anybody, and for a moment Hugh thought his mind was playing tricks on him, the way it sometimes did after too many weeks alone with only the wind and the elk for company. He stopped his mule at the bend in the trail and listened. It was a real tune, not the wind fooling him. Something slow and mournful, a melody that seemed to ache the way a person aches when they have been too long without a kind word. He came around the bend slow, the way a man moves when he does not want to startle a deer, and there she was. She stood on a wide, flat shelf of sandstone where the canyon opened out into a bowl maybe 200 feet across, her dress a faded blue calico gone soft with wear, her dark hair loose and catching the last gold light of the afternoon sun. She could not have been more than 22 years old, slight in build but standing straight as a fence post, her chin lifted, her eyes closed, the fiddle tucked beneath her jaw like it was a part of her own body. She played with her whole self, her elbow driving the bow in long strokes, her foot tapping out a rhythm against the rock, and she did not once open her eyes to see if anyone was watching, because she did not believe anyone was. Hugh sat his mule at the mouth of that canyon for a full 2 minutes before he did anything at all, because he did not want to break the spell of it. He had not heard music, real music, played by a real hand, in going on 4 years. He had heard men sing rough songs around a fire, had heard a harmonica once in a trading post in Fort Bridger, but he had not heard anything like this. A woman pouring her whole heart out into empty air because she had nowhere else to pour it. When the song ended, she let the bow fall to her side and stood there breathing hard, and Hugh saw her shoulders shake just once, like she was fighting something back. Then she straightened up again, lifted the fiddle back to her chin, and started another tune, faster this time, a reel that made his own boot want to tap despite the tiredness in his legs. He did not know how long he would have stayed hidden at the canyon mouth, watching a stranger play music to nobody, if his mule had not chosen that moment to let out a long, complaining bray, the kind mules give when they are tired of standing still and smelling water they cannot yet reach. The fiddle screamed to a stop. The woman spun around so fast she nearly lost her footing on the rock, her eyes wide and dark and afraid, and her free hand went to the pocket of her dress where Hugh could see the outline of something small and heavy, likely a pistol. "I do not mean you any harm, ma'am," Hugh said quickly, raising both his hands, palms out, the way he might approach a spooked horse. "I was riding through and heard your music. Did not mean to startle you." She did not lower her hand from her pocket, and her eyes moved over him with the careful, measuring look of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust quickly. Hugh knew what she was seeing. He was a big man, well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad from years of hauling traps and hides through mountain country, his forearms thick and corded with muscle beneath the rolled sleeves of his buckskin shirt, his dark hair falling long past his collar, because there had been no barber within 100 miles in longer than he cared to remember. His beard was trimmed shorter than most trappers kept theirs, but he knew he still looked like exactly what he was, a man who lived rough and alone in high country, and he understood why a woman alone in a canyon might take one look at him and reach for a gun. "You are trespassing," she said, her voice steadier than her hand. "This is my canyon." Hugh almost smiled at that, though he kept his face solemn out of respect for her fear. "I did not know canyons could be owned, ma'am, but I will grant you this one, if that is what you are asking. I only stopped because I have not heard fiddle music since before the winter of '72, and I could not make my feet move on." Something in her face shifted then, a softening around the eyes that told him her fear was losing ground to something else, maybe curiosity, maybe simple exhaustion at being afraid of every stranger who crossed her path. She let her hand drop away from her pocket. "You truly stopped for the music," she said, not quite a question, like she was testing the idea in her own mouth to see if it sounded believable. "I truly did," Hugh said. He swung down off his mule slow and careful, keeping his hands visible, and he saw her watch every motion of him with the wariness of a woman who had been hurt before and did not intend to be hurt again. He stayed a good 20 feet back from her, near his mule, and did not come any closer. "My name is Hugh Alden. I trap and trade through these mountains most of the year. I mean you no trouble, ma'am, and I will ride on if my company is not wanted." She studied him a long moment before she answered. "Minnie Thatcher," she said finally, "and I did not say your company was not wanted. I said this was my canyon. A body can say both things and mean them different ways." That drew a real smile out of him, the first one he had felt cross his face in longer than he wanted to admit. "I reckon that is fair, Miss Thatcher." She lowered the fiddle from her shoulder but kept it cradled against her chest, the way a mother might hold a child, protective and unwilling to let it go even for a moment. Hugh noticed the fiddle itself then, really looked at it, and saw that despite the care she clearly gave it, it was an old instrument, its varnish worn thin along the neck where countless hands before hers must have gripped it, a long crack running near the scroll that had been mended with what looked like sinew and glue. "You play beautiful," Hugh said, and he meant it plain and simple, no flattery in it, just truth. "I have heard fiddlers in saloons from Cheyenne to Fort Laramie, and none of them played like what I just heard." Minnie's chin lifted again, that same proud tilt he had seen when she first came into view, but now he understood it was not pride exactly. It was armor. "Nobody has ever heard me play in a saloon, Mr. Alden. Nobody has heard me play anywhere at all, not in 3 years." "Then who were you playing for just now?" She looked away from him, out across the canyon bowl, and her eyes went distant in a way that told him there was a story there, one that likely had some hurt woven through it. "Nobody," she said. "I play for the rocks. The rocks do not turn me away." Hugh did not press her further in that moment, sensing that a woman who kept a pistol in her pocket and played fiddle alone in a canyon miles from any town was not going to unburden her whole history to a stranger she had met 5 minutes prior. Instead, he did the thing that came most natural to a man who had spent years reading the moods of wild country and wilder animals. He waited, and he let silence do the work that questions could not. "You are a long way from any town," he said instead, keeping his tone easy. "There is no settlement within a day's ride of here that I know of, and I know this country better than most." "I know how far I am," Minnie said, a little sharp, and then seemed to catch herself, softening. "Forgive me. It has been a hard season. I have a camp a short walk from here near a spring. I did not mean to snap at you. No need to apologize to me, ma'am. A woman alone out here has earned the right to snap at whoever wanders into her canyon." That won him the ghost of a smile, quick and gone, but real while it lasted. Hugh found himself wanting to see it again. The sun was dropping fast behind the western rim of the canyon, painting the red rock in shades of copper and rust, and Hugh knew from long habit that darkness fell hard and quick in this broken country, without much warning between daylight and true night. He glanced at the sky, gauging maybe an hour of good light left. "If it is not too forward of me to ask," he said, "would you permit me to walk with you back to your camp, just to see you safe? I will not come further than you wish, and I will make my own camp elsewhere. I only would not feel right riding on and leaving a woman alone out here with night coming." Minnie's eyes narrowed slightly, weighing him again, and Hugh let her look her fill, understanding that trust was not a thing to be rushed. Finally she nodded, once, short and businesslike. "You may walk with me that far, but do not think it means anything more than that, Mr. Alden. I have managed alone a long while now, and I intend to keep managing." "Understood, Miss Thatcher," Hugh said, and meant it, though something in his chest had already begun to shift, some old dormant thing waking up at the sight of her standing proud and fierce and alone on that red rock with her fiddle, held like a shield against the whole world. They walked together through the canyon, Minnie leading the way with a familiarity that told him she had been in this country some while, Hugh following a respectful distance behind with his mule's lead rope in hand. The canyon narrowed and then opened again into a smaller side pocket where a thin spring trickled out of the rock face into a shallow pool, and near that pool sat a small camp, a canvas lean-to strung between two scrub cedars, a fire ring blackened with old use, a few cooking implements arranged with the careful order of someone who had learned to make do with very little. "This is my camp," Minnie said, something defensive in the set of her shoulders as she watched him take it in. Hugh kept his face carefully neutral, though inside he felt a tightening of concern. A canvas lean-to was no shelter at all against a mountain autumn, and he could already feel the bite of cold creeping into the evening air, the kind of cold that in these elevations could turn to snow with almost no warning once October gave way to November. "How long have you been camped here, if you do not mind my asking?" 6 weeks, Minnie said. "Maybe 7. I have lost some count of the days. And before that." She was quiet a moment, poking at the cold ashes of her fire ring with the toe of her worn boot. "Before that, I was somewhere I do not care to speak of, Mr. Alden. And before you ask further, I will tell you plain that I did not run from the law, if that is your worry. I have done nothing wrong except perhaps trust the wrong man once." Hugh nodded slowly, understanding there was pain behind those words that he had no right to dig at, not yet, maybe not ever if she did not choose to give it to him. "I was not worried on that account," he said. "I was only thinking that winter comes hard in this country, and a canvas lean-to will not turn snow come the season. I have managed so far. I do not doubt your grit, ma'am. I am only telling you what I know of these mountains, having wintered in them more years than I care to count." He crouched down and began building a fire in her ring without asking permission, the old habit of a man who had spent years making camp for himself and had never quite learned to sit idle while there was useful work to be done. Minnie watched him with a wary eye but did not stop him. "There is an old trapper's cabin about 4 miles north of here, up near Bear Creek, sound structure, stone chimney, a roof that has held through worse winters than this one is likely to bring. It stands empty most years. I have wintered there myself some seasons. Are you offering me a cabin, Mr. Alden, or offering me your company in a cabin? Because I will tell you plainly that I will accept the first and refuse the second." Hugh looked up at her from where he knelt building the fire, and something about the directness of her, the fierce practical honesty of a woman who had clearly learned to name things plainly rather than let ambiguity put her in danger, made him respect her all the more. "I am offering you a roof, Miss Thatcher, nothing more and nothing less. I have my own camp I keep some distance off, and I would not think of imposing myself where I was not wanted. But I could not ride on tomorrow knowing a woman was fixing to winter under canvas in this country. It would sit wrong with me the rest of my days." Minnie studied him a long while in the gathering dusk, the firelight now catching and dancing across her face, and Hugh saw the exhaustion in her then, deep and bone-set, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone against hard country for too long without rest. "Why do you care what happens to a stranger?" she asked, quiet. Hugh considered the question honestly before answering, because it deserved an honest answer. "I do not rightly know, ma'am, except that I have spent 4 winters alone in these mountains since my brother died of fever, and in all that time I have not once heard anything as fine as what came out of your fiddle this afternoon. Seems to me a world that can make music like that is not a world that ought to let the maker of it freeze come January." Something in Minnie's face cracked then, just slightly, like a dam giving the smallest bit under great pressure, and she looked away quickly into the fire, blinking hard. "Nobody has said anything kind to me about my playing in a long while," she said, so quiet he almost did not catch it. "Then I reckon it was past time somebody did." They sat by the fire that first night with a careful distance between them, sharing a simple meal of Hugh's dried venison and some wild onions Minnie had gathered, and though neither of them spoke much more of substance, something had been established between them, a fragile bridge of trust laid across a canyon of caution. When Hugh finally rose to make his own camp a quarter-mile off, as he had promised, Minnie surprised him by speaking first. "Thank you, Mr. Alden, for listening, and for not asking more than I was ready to give. There is time enough for the rest, Miss Thatcher, if you ever care to give it. I will come by in the morning if that suits you, and we can talk on that cabin." She nodded, and Hugh walked off into the dark canyon with his mule, leaving her alone by her small fire. And though he had known her mere hours, he found his thoughts circling back to her the whole walk to his own camp, to the fierce, proud tilt of her chin, and the way her music had sounded like grief given voice. The next morning came clear and cold, frost silvering the sage brush, and Hugh returned to Minnie's camp as promised, finding her already awake and boiling coffee over a rekindled fire. She greeted him with a nod, more relaxed than the evening before, as though the night alone had given her time to settle her judgment of him into something less guarded. "I have been thinking on your cabin," she said without preamble, handing him a tin cup of coffee that tasted bitter and strong and better than anything he had drunk in weeks. "I will look at it. That is not agreement to take it, only agreement to look." "Fair enough," Hugh said, hiding his pleasure at the small victory. "It is a few hours' walk from here, north along the creek. We could make it there and back before dark if we start soon." They broke camp together, Minnie packing her few belongings with the efficient economy of someone who had learned to travel light out of necessity rather than choice. And Hugh could not help noticing how carefully she wrapped her fiddle in an oilcloth, before tucking it into a canvas satchel she wore across her body, never letting it more than an arm's length from her person. As they walked, Hugh leading his mule along the narrow game trail that wound north through the canyon country toward Bear Creek, he found himself stealing glances at Minnie walking beside him, noting the quiet grace in how she moved through rough terrain, sure-footed despite the loose scree and uneven ground, like a woman accustomed to hardship but not broken by it. "May I ask you something, Miss Thatcher?" "You may ask. I will decide whether to answer." Hugh smiled at that, a small private smile, appreciating her sharp wit even when it was aimed at keeping him at bay. "How does a woman come to be alone in this country with nothing but a fiddle and a pistol?" "I do not ask to pry, only because I am curious, and because I think you are the most interesting person I have met in some years." Minnie walked a while in silence before answering, and Hugh let her take her time, having learned already that pressing her only made her retreat further into herself. "I was a fiddler with a traveling show," she said finally. "Thatcher's Family Players, we were called, though there was no family in it by the end, only my father and myself, and a manager named Silas Crane who took most every dollar we earned, and called it fair payment for his trouble in booking us halls and saloons across the territory. My father died 2 years back, of a lung fever caught sleeping rough in a wagon during a bad winter storm in Nebraska. After that, Crane said I owed him for my father's debts, said I would keep playing for him until the debt was paid, though I never once saw an account of what that debt was supposed to be." "That sounds like a debt invented to keep you working for nothing," Hugh said, feeling an old anger rise in him at the injustice of it. "That is exactly what it was," Minnie said, her voice hardening. "I played 6 nights a week in saloons that smelled of spilled whiskey and worse, men shouting over my music, sometimes throwing bottles when they did not care for a tune, and Crane took every dollar earned and gave me only enough to eat, saying the rest went toward my debt. This went on near 2 years, until this past summer, when I finally understood the debt would never be paid, that he intended to keep me indentured to him until I was too old or too broken to fiddle anymore, and then likely toss me aside for some younger girl he could exploit the same way." "So you left," Hugh said, understanding now the fierce independence in her, the wariness of strangers, the pistol kept close at hand. "I left in the night from a camp near Fort Fetterman, took only my fiddle and what money I had managed to hide away over 2 years of careful thieving from my own earnings. And I have been moving through this country alone since, staying clear of towns where Crane might have men looking for me, playing to empty canyons because I could not bear to stop playing altogether, but could not risk being heard by anyone who might carry word back to him. Hugh felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest at her words, an anger on her behalf that surprised him with its intensity given how briefly he had known her. "Has this Crane come looking for you? Do you have reason to think he still might?" "I do not know," Minnie admitted. "I have heard nothing, seen no sign of pursuit, but I have also not dared to settle anywhere long enough to find out for certain. That is why I have kept moving camp to camp, canyon to canyon, these past months." "Well," Hugh said, "you need not keep running forever, Miss Thatcher. This is wild country, and wild country has room enough for a person to disappear into it entire, if that is what is needed. The cabin I am taking you to sits in a fold of the mountains that few men know of besides myself and a handful of other trappers. If you wanted a place to winter safe, hidden from any man with ill intent, I do not know of a better spot in this whole territory." Minnie looked at him then, something searching in her gaze, as though she were trying to determine whether his kindness came with hidden strings the way Crane's false generosity always had. Hugh met her look steady and open, letting her search find nothing but what was plainly there, a man who wanted to help because helping felt like the only right thing to do. "Why are you being so kind to me, Mr. Alden? Truly. Men are not often kind without wanting something in return in my experience." "I am sorry your experience has taught you that," Hugh said, and he meant it with a depth that surprised him. "I cannot speak for other men, only for myself. I lost my brother to fever 4 winters back, and since then I have lived alone in these mountains with only my traps and my thoughts for company. I had near forgotten what it felt like to want to look after someone besides myself, until I heard you playing yesterday. I am not asking anything of you, Miss Thatcher, except perhaps the chance to hear you play again someday, when you are ready to have an audience that is not made of rock." Minnie was quiet a long while after that, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its guarded edge. "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I care to admit." They reached the cabin by early afternoon, and Hugh watched Minnie's face carefully as she took it in, wanting to gauge her reaction before he said anything further. The cabin sat in a sheltered fold of land near Bear Creek, built of solid hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end, a small but sturdy structure that had clearly been built by someone who knew mountain winters intimately and had built accordingly. The roof was shingled with split cedar, tight and sound, and a covered porch ran along the front where firewood could be stacked dry through even the heaviest snows. "Whose cabin is this?" Minnie asked, running a hand along the rough-hewn door frame. "Built by an old trapper named Jedediah Cross, some 15 years back. He passed on 3 winters ago up near his trap line and left no family that anyone knew of. Since then it has stood empty, though I and a few others use it from time to time when we are through this country. Nobody would object to you wintering here, Miss Thatcher. I can promise you that." Minnie pushed open the door and stepped inside, and Hugh followed a step behind, watching her survey the single room with its stone fireplace, its rough plank floor, a simple bed frame strung with rawhide, a table and 2 chairs that had survived the years better than most furniture out here had any right to. It was not grand, but it was solid, and it was dry, and after a winter under canvas, Hugh imagined it must look like a palace to her. "It is more than I hoped for," Minnie said softly, and Hugh heard the emotion thick in her voice. "I do not know how to thank you for this, Mr. Alden. No thanks needed. Only promise me you will let me know if you need anything through the winter. I keep a camp not 4 miles from here, and I check my trap line through this whole stretch of country regular. I would not be intruding to check on you now and again, if that is agreeable." "That would be agreeable," Minnie said, and this time her smile came fuller, warmer, lasting longer than any she had given him before, and Hugh felt something in his chest turn over slow and sweet at the sight of it. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter and the first snows began dusting the high peaks, Hugh found reasons to pass by the Bear Creek cabin with a regularity that went well beyond simple neighborly concern, though he told himself each time that he was only checking his trap line, only making sure she had enough firewood, only bringing by fresh meat from a successful hunt, because it seemed a waste to let it spoil when there was a hungry person nearby who could use it. Minnie, for her part, began to relax more fully into her new safety, the wariness in her eyes softening bit by bit each time Hugh appeared at her door, until by the third week she had taken to setting an extra cup out for coffee whenever she heard his mule approaching, before he had even announced himself. It was on one such visit, in the first week of November, with a thin skin of snow covering the ground and the air carrying that particular bite that promised heavier falls to come, that Hugh finally heard Minnie play for him directly, not overheard from a distance across an empty canyon, but offered freely face to face, in the warm firelit interior of the cabin. "Would you like to hear something, Mr. Alden?" she asked, after they had finished a simple supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, the fire crackling low and golden in the stone hearth. Hugh looked up, surprised and pleased in equal measure. "I would like that more than almost anything I can think of, Miss Thatcher." She retrieved her fiddle from its careful place near the bed, unwrapped it from the oilcloth with the same tenderness he had noticed that first day in the canyon, and drew the bow across the strings to test the tuning before settling into a slow, sweet melody that filled the small cabin entire, the sound somehow richer and warmer contained within four walls than it had been bouncing off canyon rock. Hugh sat perfectly still through the whole song, not wanting to break the spell of it, watching her face as she played, the way her eyes closed and her whole body seemed to sway with the music, the way some private joy seemed to light her from within even as the melody itself carried an undertone of old sorrow. When the song ended, he found he had been holding his breath, and he let it out slow. "That was the finest thing I have heard in my whole life," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with feeling. Minnie opened her eyes and looked at him, and something passed between them in that look, unspoken but unmistakable, a recognition of feeling that neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, but that both of them felt settle into the room like a third presence. "You are the first person to hear me play in 3 years who was not paying to hear it or forcing me to play it," Minnie said quietly. "I did not know how much that would matter until just now." "It matters," Hugh said. "You matter, Miss Thatcher. Your music matters. I hope you know that, whatever that man Crane tried to make you believe." Minnie set the fiddle down carefully across her lap and looked at Hugh for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears that she seemed determined not to let fall. "I have been thinking, these past weeks," she said slowly, "that I had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at without someone wanting something taken from me. You have never once asked anything of me, Mr. Alden, not one single thing, and I do not know what to do with a kindness that asks for nothing in return." "You do not have to do anything with it," Hugh said gently. "Only let it be what it is." The weeks that followed brought them closer still, in the small and steady ways that come from shared meals and shared silences, and the particular intimacy of two people learning each other's rhythms through the long, slow days of a mountain winter. Hugh taught Minnie how to set snares for rabbits and grouse, so she would not go hungry on days he could not visit. Minnie taught Hugh, in turn, the basics of reading music from a small tattered songbook she carried, though he confessed he had no talent for the fiddle himself and would likely never manage more than a passable hum. By December, the snows had come heavy and full, closing the high passes and making travel between their two camps more difficult, though Hugh managed it regardless, snowshoeing the 4 miles between his camp and the Bear Creek cabin at least twice a week, sometimes more, carrying supplies, checking on her welfare, and increasingly simply wanting to see her face and hear her voice and watch the way firelight caught in her dark hair. It was on a night in mid-December, with a blizzard howling outside the cabin walls and the fire built high against the cold, that Hugh finally spoke the feelings he had been carrying since that first afternoon in the canyon. He had come by earlier that day to check on her before the storm broke, and the weather had turned so fast and so fierce that riding back to his own camp had become a foolish risk, a fact Minnie had pointed out to him with blunt practicality, insisting he stay the night rather than risk freezing to death out of some misplaced sense of propriety. "I will not have your death on my conscience, Mr. Alden, only because you were too stubborn to accept shelter that is plainly available to you," she had said, and Hugh, recognizing sound sense when he heard it, had agreed, though he made a point of arranging his bedroll on the far side of the room, near the door, respectful of the distance she had always maintained between them despite their growing closeness. They sat now on either side of the fire, the wind screaming outside, snow hissing against the shuttered window, and Minnie had her fiddle out again, playing something slow and thoughtful, a melody Hugh had not heard from her before. "What is that one called?" he asked when she finished. Minnie was quiet a moment, looking at the fiddle in her lap rather than at him. "I have not given it a name yet. I have been composing it myself these past weeks. It does not belong to any song I learned from my father or from any hall we played in. It is only mine." "It is beautiful," Hugh said. "It sounds like—" He paused, searching for words adequate to what he had felt listening to it. "It sounds like hope that has been through hard weather but come out the other side of it anyway." Minnie looked up at him then, startled, her eyes wide in the firelight. "That is exactly what I meant it to sound like. How did you know that?" "Because that is what you sound like to me, Minnie," Hugh said, using her given name for the first time since they had met, and watching her breath catch at the sound of it. "You have been through hard weather. Anyone with eyes could see that much. But you have come out the other side of it with your music still in you, still whole, still yours. I do not know that I have ever admired anything so much as I admire that in you." The fire popped and settled, and the wind howled on outside, but inside the small cabin, something had gone very still and very quiet between them. "Hugh," Minnie said, and it was the first time she had used his given name either, and the sound of it in her voice did something to him that he felt clear down to his boots. "I have been afraid to say this, because I have been wrong about men before, and that wrongness cost me dear. But I do not think I am wrong about you. I think you are the finest man I have ever known, and I think I have come to care for you more than is sensible for a woman who has known a man scarcely 2 months. Hugh set down the cup of coffee he had been holding and moved across the small distance between them, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level, close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in the brown of her eyes, reflecting the firelight. "Minnie Thatcher," he said, his voice rough with feeling he had been holding carefully in check for weeks. "I have lived alone in these mountains going on 4 years, telling myself I was content with silence and solitude, and then I heard you playing to an empty canyon, pouring your whole heart into music that you believed nobody wanted, and something in me that had gone quiet for a long while woke up and has not gone back to sleep since. I do not think I am wrong either when I tell you that I love you. I have loved you, I think, since that very first afternoon, though I did not have the words for it then." Minnie's eyes filled with tears that spilled over freely this time, no longer held back, and she set her fiddle carefully aside on the table before reaching out to touch Hugh's face, her fingers gentle against his bearded jaw. "I love you too, Hugh Alden," she said. "I did not think I would ever trust a man enough to say those words again, after Crane, after watching what men can take from a woman who has nothing left to bargain with but her own labor. But you have never once tried to take anything from me. You have only ever given." Hugh reached up and covered her hand with his own, larger hand engulfing hers entirely, and he felt her fingers tremble slightly, not with fear this time, but with something else entirely, something that mirrored the fierce, tender feeling swelling in his own chest. "May I kiss you, Minnie?" "Yes," she breathed. "Please." The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, careful, as though each of them was testing the fragile new territory of the other's trust, but it deepened slowly into something fuller, something that carried within it all the weeks of careful courtship, all the shared meals and shared silences, all the music that had passed between them like a language neither of them had needed words to understand. When they finally parted, both of them breathless, Hugh rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, shaking exhale. "I have wanted to do that since the first night I walked you back to your camp in that canyon," he admitted. Minnie laughed, a sound bright and surprised, as though she had forgotten she still had laughter in her. "I thought about it too, that first night, though I would not have admitted it to you then for anything in the world." They sat together by the fire long into the night after that, talking of things they had not spoken of before, Hugh telling her more fully of his brother's death, of the loneliness of the years since, of how he had come to think he might live out his whole life in these mountains with nothing but pelts and solitude for company, never expecting a woman with a fiddle and a fierce, independent spirit to walk into his life and change the whole shape of what he wanted from it. Minnie, in turn, told him more of her father, a gentle man who had taught her to play when she was scarcely 8 years old, who had loved her fiercely, but had also, in his desperation after her mother's early death, made choices that bound them both to Silas Crane's cruel management for far too many years. She told him of nights on the road, sleeping in wagons, of towns that had cheered her playing and towns that had jeered it, of the particular loneliness of being surrounded by crowds every night and yet feeling utterly unseen, because nobody in those crowds cared for her as a person, only for the entertainment she provided. "You are the first person," she said, echoing what she had told him weeks before, "who has ever listened to me play and heard me, truly heard me, rather than just hearing a fiddle. That has meant more to me than I know how to say, Hugh." "Then let me keep hearing you," Hugh said, "for as long as you will let me." The blizzard raged on outside through that whole night, but inside the small cabin at Bear Creek, something warm and new had taken root, and neither Hugh nor Minnie doubted any longer what it meant. By the time the deepest cold of January had set in, Hugh had all but moved himself into the cabin, splitting his time between checking his trap lines and simply being present with Minnie through the long snowbound days, and neither of them made any pretense any longer about the nature of their feelings for each other. They had not yet spoken of marriage directly, though it hung in the air between them like a promise not yet fully voiced, and Hugh found himself thinking of it more and more as the weeks passed, imagining a future that stretched out ahead of him in a way he had not allowed himself to imagine in the 4 lonely years since his brother's death. It was in late January, during a brief spell of clear weather that allowed for a supply run down to the small trading settlement at South Pass City, some days' ride from their mountain camps, that trouble finally arrived, trouble in the shape of a name Minnie had hoped never to hear again. Hugh had gone into South Pass City alone to trade pelts for supplies, leaving Minnie safely tucked away at the cabin, when he heard, in the general store where he was conducting his business, 2 men discussing a recent arrival to the settlement, a man calling himself an agent for a traveling entertainment company, asking after a runaway fiddler who had absconded with property belonging to his employer some months prior, offering a reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Hugh's blood went cold at the description that followed. A young woman, dark-haired, traveling alone, known to carry a fiddle with a distinctive mended crack near the scroll. He finished his business as quickly as he could without arousing suspicion, purchased his supplies, and made his way out of South Pass City with his heart hammering, his mind racing through the implications of what he had overheard. Crane, or someone working for Crane, had tracked Minnie's trail this far into the mountains. It would only be a matter of time, perhaps days, before that trail led them to Bear Creek. He rode hard back toward the mountains, pushing his mule as fast as the animal could manage over the frozen trails, and reached the cabin well after dark, finding Minnie waiting anxiously by the fire, having sensed something was wrong the moment she heard the urgency in his approach. "Hugh, what has happened?" "Crane's men are in South Pass City," Hugh said, breathing hard from the ride. "Asking after a runaway fiddler, offering reward money. They described you exact, Minnie, down to the crack in your fiddle's scroll. They will find this cabin soon enough, if they have picked up your trail this far." Minnie's face went pale, her hand flying instinctively to grip the edge of the table, and Hugh saw all the old fear come rushing back into her eyes, fear he had hoped was beginning to fade for good. "How could they have found me? I have been so careful." "I do not know," Hugh admitted. "Perhaps someone in one of the towns you passed through recognized you, or perhaps Crane has simply had men searching this whole territory for months, working the trails methodical until they turned up something. It does not matter how. What matters is what we do now." Minnie sank into a chair, her hands trembling, and Hugh crossed the room quickly to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his own, steadying her with his presence. "I will not let him take you," Hugh said, his voice low and fierce with a protectiveness that came from somewhere deep and elemental in him. "I swear that to you, Minnie. Whatever it takes, I will not let that man put his hands on you again." "You do not understand what he is capable of," Minnie said. "He has men who do his dirty work, men who would not hesitate to use force if it came to that. I do not want you hurt on my account, Hugh. I have lived alone in these mountains for years, Minnie Thatcher, hunting bear and cougar and surviving winters that have killed stronger men than Silas Crane's hired hands could ever hope to be. I am not afraid of what he might send after us. What I am afraid of is losing you, now that I have finally found you." They spent that night making plans, deciding that the safest course was not to flee further into the mountains, which might only delay the inevitable, but to confront the matter directly, to establish plainly and legally that Minnie owed Crane nothing, that any so-called debt he claimed had been invented from nothing, and had no standing that any honest court would recognize. Hugh knew a circuit judge who rode through the territory twice yearly, a man named Judge Everett Hollies, known for fair dealing and little patience for exploitation of vulnerable people, and Hugh proposed they seek him out, present Minnie's case formally, and put an end to Crane's claims once and for all through legal means rather than simply running forever. "If we can prove the debt was fabricated, and I believe we can, given that you kept no formal record of wages owed against expenses claimed, Crane will have no legal ground to stand on. He will not be able to touch you, and his men will have no reason to trouble us further. And if he does not accept that, if he sends men regardless of what any judge says, then he will find that I do not take kindly to men who threaten what is mine to protect," Hugh said, and something in the set of his jaw, the hard, cold determination in his eyes, told Minnie he meant every word of it. They rode together 3 days later to the small town of Lander, where Judge Hollies was known to be holding circuit court that season, and Hugh stood beside Minnie through the whole difficult process of presenting her case, offering what testimony he could regarding her character and circumstances, while Minnie herself spoke with a courage that impressed Hugh anew, detailing plainly and without embellishment the 2 years of exploitation she had endured under Crane's management, the lack of any honest accounting of wages, the threats that had kept her compliant long after any real debt might reasonably have been settled. Judge Hollies, a stern but fair man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed little, listened to the whole account with careful attention, and at its conclusion, he issued a ruling that Hugh would remember gratefully for the rest of his life. He declared that no legal debt existed between Minnie Thatcher and Silas Crane, that any claim to the contrary was to be considered fraudulent and unenforceable, and further, that should Crane or his agents attempt to pursue Miss Thatcher further through threat or force, they would be subject to arrest and prosecution for extortion and unlawful restraint. "You are a free woman, Miss Thatcher," Judge Hollies said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority that even a man like Crane would find difficult to ignore. "No man has claim on you that you have not freely given, and I will see that this ruling is recorded and made known should this Crane fellow attempt any further mischief." Minnie's relief was so profound that Hugh saw her legs nearly give way beneath her, and he caught her elbow, steadying her, as tears of relief rather than fear ran freely down her face. "Thank you," she said, to the judge, to Hugh, to the whole world it seemed, her voice thick with an emotion too large for simple words. They returned to the mountains with a lightness between them that had not existed before. The shadow of Crane's pursuit finally lifted, and though they later learned through word passed along trapper channels that Crane's agent had indeed made his way toward South Pass City with intentions of tracking Minnie down, news of the judge's ruling had reached the man first, delivered by a deputy sent along by Judge Hollis himself, and the agent, faced with the prospect of arrest for extortion, had abandoned his pursuit entirely and returned east. Crane's operation, apparently deciding the trouble, was not worth the legal risk now that their false claims had been formally exposed. With that threat lifted, Hugh and Minnie settled into the remainder of that winter with a sense of peace neither of them had known in years, the cabin at Bear Creek becoming truly a shared home rather than simply a shelter, filled increasingly with Minnie's music, which she now played freely and often, no longer hiding herself away in empty canyons, but sharing her gift openly with the one person whose presence made an audience of one feel like the whole world listening. It was on a night in early March, with the first hints of spring beginning to soften the harsh edges of winter, the snow starting to retreat from the lower slopes and the days lengthening bit by bit, that Hugh finally asked the question he had been carrying in his heart for months. He had planned it carefully, though careful planning did not come naturally to a man more accustomed to reading weather and animal sign than orchestrating romantic gestures. He had traded for a small gold band at the last trading post visit, tucking it away secretly, waiting for the right moment, and that moment came as they sat together by the fire after a simple supper, Minnie having just finished playing the melody she had composed months before, the one she had once told him had no name. "Minnie," Hugh said, setting aside his coffee cup and moving to kneel before her chair, much as he had that first night he confessed his love, "I have been thinking on that song of yours, the one without a name." "What of it?" Minnie asked, smiling, though something in his tone had already brought a flush of anticipation to her cheeks. "I think it needs a name now," Hugh said, "and I think I know what it should be called." "And what is that?" Hugh reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the small gold band, holding it up between them in the firelight, and watched Minnie's breath catch, her hand rising to cover her mouth. "I think you should call it Coming Home," Hugh said, his voice rough with feeling. "Because that is what you have given me, Minnie Thatcher, since the very first afternoon I heard you playing in that canyon. You gave me a reason to want a home again. After years of thinking I did not need one, and I do not want to spend one more winter of my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" Minnie's tears came fast and full, and she slid down from her chair to kneel with him on the floor before the fire, taking his face in both her hands. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Hugh Alden, 1,000 times yes. I love you more than I know how to say, and I cannot imagine any future now that does not have you in it." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite their strength, and then he kissed her, long and full and certain, sealing the promise between them with a tenderness that spoke of everything they had built together through that long, hard winter, from wary strangers to devoted partners, from a woman who played to empty stone and a man who had forgotten how to want company, into two people who had found, against every improbable odd of a chance meeting in a wild canyon, exactly what each of them had needed most. They were married that spring in early May, when the mountain passes had cleared enough for travel, and the wildflowers had begun their brief, brilliant bloom across the high meadows. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church at South Pass City, officiated by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, with a small gathering of witnesses that included several trappers Hugh had known for years, a few kind women from the settlement who had befriended Minnie during their supply visits over the winter, and even Judge Hollis himself, who happened to be riding circuit through the area again, and insisted on attending once he learned of the occasion, declaring with a rare smile that he considered himself partly responsible for this happy outcome, and intended to see it through to its conclusion. Minnie wore a simple dress of blue calico, not so different from the one she had worn that first day in the canyon, though this one was new and unworn by hard travel, a gift from the settlement women who had taken to her over the winter months. She carried her fiddle with her even to her own wedding, and after the vows were spoken and the preacher pronounced them man and wife, she surprised everyone gathered by lifting the instrument to her chin and playing a piece she had composed especially for the occasion, a bright, joyful reel that had the small gathering clapping and stamping their feet in time, a far cry indeed from the mournful melodies that had once echoed alone through an empty canyon. Hugh watched her play with a heart so full he thought it might burst from the fullness of it, remembering that first afternoon when he had stumbled upon a woman pouring her whole soul into music for an audience of nothing but rock and sky, and marveling at how far they had both traveled since then, not merely in miles across the Wyoming mountains, but in the deeper journey of two wounded, weary hearts learning to trust and love again. They settled permanently at the Bear Creek cabin after that, Hugh continuing his trapping trade through the winter months while also, over the following years, developing a small ranching operation on the fertile land near the creek, running cattle that thrived on the abundant summer grass of the high mountain meadows. Minnie, for her part, became known throughout the growing settlements of that stretch of Wyoming territory as a fiddler without equal, playing at dances and celebrations, and eventually, as more families settled the region and towns grew larger, teaching music to children eager to learn, passing on the gift her own father had given her so many years before, transforming what had once been a source of exploitation and pain into a source of joy and connection within their growing community. The following autumn, almost exactly 1 year after that first fateful afternoon in the canyon, Minnie discovered she was carrying their first child, and Hugh's joy at the news was so complete that Minnie later teased him for weeks about the foolish grin he had worn for days afterward, unable to stop himself from smiling at the simplest things, at the thought of the family they were building together in this wild, beautiful country that had brought them to each other against every reasonable expectation. Their first child was born the following spring, a healthy boy they named Jedediah, after the old trapper who had built the cabin that had sheltered them through that first crucial winter and given them the safety they needed to fall properly in love. Jedediah Alden grew up strong and curious, spending his early childhood roaming the mountain meadows near Bear Creek, and by the time he was old enough to hold a small fiddle of his own, a gift his mother had specially commissioned from a maker in Cheyenne, he showed every sign of inheriting her musical gift, much to both his parents' delight. 2 years after Jedediah's birth, a daughter followed, whom they named Sarah after Minnie's own mother, lost so many years before, and Sarah grew to share her father's love of the mountains and the outdoors, becoming, as she grew older, nearly as skilled a tracker and hunter as Hugh himself, much to his immense pride, while also inheriting enough of her mother's musical talent to fill the cabin most evenings with the sound of 2 fiddles playing together, mother and daughter, weaving melodies that echoed through the mountain valley, in a chorus of joy that stood in sharp contrast to the lonely music that had once bounced unheard off empty canyon walls. Life was not without its ordinary hardships, of course, as life rarely is even in the happiest of circumstances. There were hard winters that tested their resources, seasons when cattle sickened and had to be nursed carefully back to health. One particularly frightening summer when young Jedediah fell ill with a fever that had Minnie and Hugh both sitting up through 3 sleepless nights, praying and tending him with every remedy they knew, until the fever finally broke and the boy recovered fully, leaving both his parents shaken but profoundly grateful. But through all of it, the ordinary trials and the occasional genuine crises, Hugh and Minnie faced life together with a partnership that had been forged in that first hard winter of trust, building slowly between two wary, wounded souls. And that partnership only deepened with each passing year. Each shared struggle, each moment of joy celebrated together in their mountain home. Word of Minnie's musical talent eventually spread far enough that, some 8 years after their marriage, a representative from a legitimate concert hall in Denver made the long journey to Bear Creek specifically to invite her to perform. Having heard tales of the extraordinary fiddler living in the Wyoming mountains from travelers who had passed through the growing settlements nearby, and heard her play at local gatherings. Minnie, now a mother of 2 with a life she treasured deeply rooted in the mountains she had come to call home, considered the invitation carefully with Hugh at her side. "You should go," Hugh told her, though something in his voice carried a note of reluctance he could not fully hide, the old fear of losing what he had found still living somewhere deep within him, despite the years of proven devotion between them. "I do not need Denver, Hugh," Minnie said, taking his weathered hands in her own, hands that had grown strong and capable through years of ranch work alongside her music, hands still bearing the small calluses of the bow and strings even after all this time. "I have all the audience I ever wanted right here. I found what I was looking for in that canyon, though I did not know I was looking for it until you found me there. I do not need Denver, or fame, or any hall full of strangers paying to hear me play. I have you, and our children and this valley, and that is a fuller life than any I ever imagined for myself, back when I was running from Crane with nothing but a fiddle and a fear that I would never find safety anywhere in this world." Hugh's eyes grew bright with feeling at her words, and he pulled her close, resting his chin against the top of her dark hair, still soft and fragrant despite the years, still carrying that same fierce spirit he had first glimpsed on a red sandstone shelf in an empty canyon so many years before. "I love you, Minnie Alden," he said, using her married name with the same tenderness he had once used her given name for the first time, that snowbound night when everything between them had finally been spoken aloud. "I love you too, Hugh Alden. I have from nearly the very first moment, though it took my stubborn heart a little while to admit it." She did travel to Denver eventually, though not to perform professionally as the concert hall representative had hoped, but simply for a visit, bringing Hugh and their 2 children along to see the growing city and enjoy a rare family excursion beyond their familiar mountain valley. She played one evening at a small gathering hosted by friends they had made through the years, and the applause that followed her performance was warm and genuine, but Hugh noticed, watching her face as she took her small bow, that the joy in her eyes was no different, no more intense, than the joy he had seen countless times in their own cabin, playing for an audience of only him and their children. Because for Minnie, the truest measure of music had never been the size of the crowd but the honesty of the listening. And she had found that honesty first and most completely in a mountain man who had stopped his mule at the mouth of a canyon, because he could not make his feet move on past the sound of a woman pouring her heart into empty air. They lived out their years together at Bear Creek, watching their children grow, watching the wild territory around them slowly transform as more settlers arrived, as towns grew into small cities, as the railroad eventually pushed its way through parts of the region that had once known nothing but silence and wind, and the occasional lonely fiddle tune. Through all that change, the cabin at Bear Creek remained a constant, a home built first by an old trapper's careful hands, and then remade into something even sturdier by the love between a mountain man and the lost fiddler he had found and given, at long last, the first audience that had ever truly mattered. In their later years, when their children had grown and started families of their own nearby, settling in the same valley their parents had chosen so many decades before, Hugh and Minnie would still sometimes walk together back to that original canyon, now a half-day's ride from the small ranching community that had grown up around Bear Creek, and Minnie would play there again, the same red sandstone shelf still standing as it had that first afternoon, the canyon walls still throwing the music back in echoes. Though now there was always at least one true listener present, gray-haired but still strong, still watching her with the same devotion he had felt from that very first day, a mountain man who had found something precious in an empty canyon and had spent the rest of his life making sure she never had to play to silence again. On one such visit, many years after that first meeting, when both of them had silver threading through their hair and their children had children of their own, Hugh sat on a flat rock and watched Minnie play the melody she had composed so long ago, the one they had named Coming Home on the night of his proposal. And when she finished, she lowered the fiddle and looked at him with eyes still bright despite the years, still holding that same fierce spirit that had first caught his attention. "Do you remember," she said, "how frightened I was of you that first day?" "I remember," Hugh said, smiling. "You had your hand on your pistol before I ever said a word." "I am glad you did not turn your mule around and ride away," Minnie said. "I think if you had, I might still be running from something all these years later, never finding anywhere to truly stop and be still." "I could not have ridden away," Hugh said, reaching for her hand and helping her settle beside him on the sun-warmed rock, the canyon stretching out below them in the same golden afternoon light that had first revealed her to him decades before. "Not once I heard you play. Some things a man simply knows, the moment he encounters them, and I knew that afternoon that I had found something I would spend the rest of my life protecting and cherishing, if you would only let me." "I let you," Minnie said, leaning her head against his shoulder, still solid and strong despite the passing years, the same shoulder that had carried so much weight, both literal and figurative, through their long life together. "I am so glad I let you." They sat together in the canyon a long while after that, watching the sun sink slowly toward the western horizon, painting the sandstone walls in shades of amber and rose. And though the world around them had changed enormously since that first fateful autumn afternoon in 1876, the essential truth of what they had found together in that wild, empty place remained unchanged and unshakable. A love built first on the foundation of one man's willingness to truly listen, and one woman's courage to finally believe that her music, and by extension her whole self, deserved to be heard, cherished, and never again abandoned to play alone against indifferent stone. They walked back to their home at Bear Creek as the light faded, hand in hand as they had walked together countless times before, two people who had found in each other exactly what each had needed most, a mountain man who had learned that solitude was only peace, never truly happiness, and a lost fiddler who had discovered that the most important audience she would ever play for was not measured in numbers, but in the depth of a single heart's devoted attention, freely given and faithfully sustained across all the years that followed that first extraordinary afternoon when a canyon's empty echo had, against every expectation, led her directly to the love of her whole life. And in the small ranching town that had grown up in that Wyoming valley over the decades since, the story of the mountain man and the lost fiddler became something of a local legend, told and retold to newcomers and children alike, a tale of how the wildest, loneliest places could sometimes hold the greatest gifts, if only a person had the patience and the open heart to stop and listen and truly hear what was being offered. Minnie Alden continued to play her fiddle at every community gathering for the rest of her long life, and Hugh Alden never once missed a single performance, sitting always in the front, watching his wife with the same rapt, devoted attention he had first offered her decades before at the mouth of an empty canyon, proving to everyone who witnessed it that some loves, once truly found, only grow deeper and richer with every passing year, until they become not merely a memory of how two people met, but a living testament to how faithfully they chose, every single day thereafter, to keep listening to each other's hearts.